Welcome back to Analysis. US President Barack Obama delivered a speech last week in which he left the door open for a bombing campaign in Iraq. Following Obama's speech, former Prime Minister Tony Blair also added his voice to calls for intervention. In a recent BBC interview, he said, "President Obama, I think very rightly, is saying that all options are on the table. He will be debating with his military commanders what the best form of assistance to the Iraqi government is, whether that's through drones or through fighters, or whatever is the right and appropriate response. The key thing is that they, that's the Sunni insurgents, need to know that they're not going to be able to continue their push unhindered. And as for Iranian help, for many, many Iraqis, they will want to make sure that they're not simply dependent on Iran." So, are we about to see a bombing campaign or not? My guests from the first part of the programme in the studio are still with me, and joining us on the line for this half of the programme is Ahmed Al-Mahmoud, who's from the Iraqi Spring Media Organisation. Okay, so Saba was saying earlier he doesn't think there's going to be a bombing campaign. It's one of the big questions now confronting us. Paul, what's your thinking? And would it work?
It might work to achieve some early, rather desperate successes if ISIS looked as though it were winning. I think the Americans don't want to have to do it, but I wouldn't rule it out if things go wrong. It's the backstop. But whatever the Americans do, let's remember that the Iraqi government has ordered helicopter gunship, the very powerful Apache, and some extra F-16s. They don't have any effective fighter bombers at the moment. They have only propeller planes. Those things have been held up in Congress because of fears of boosting Shia sectarianism, but they are on their way, and I imagine they're being hurried forward rather rapidly now. So when they arrive, there will certainly be more airstrikes than we've seen before, with much more potent aircraft operated, at least nominally, by Iraqis. But who knows who will actually be in the cockpits?
Mm. Chris, I mean, nobody knows, but what's your guess? Do you think the Americans are going to deploy air power?
I think they're going to have to, from their point of view. I mean, they're reluctant because they know the strategic problems, but at the same time, I think they're looking absolutely terrible. I think it's a humiliation for them, really. The people around the world are saying this is an outcome of the Iraq war, but they're also saying you're losing control of, and a very important part of the Middle East, and Iran is going to be playing a serious role at some level in terms of backing up Maliki. For Iran to do that and for the Americans not to, I think, is probably an unsupportable position amongst the US elites. On the other hand, I think it's very interesting that Cameron and Haig are coming out and saying Britain's not going to go there. I think that's actually a recognition of the depth of anti-war feeling in Britain, which is also a factor for the US. So I would say it's a difficult decision from their point of view, but I think they're probably going to go for it.
Ahmed Al-Mahmoud, welcome to the programme. I mean, that's an important kind of factor for the Americans in making this judgment, isn't it? That one of the unintended consequences of the Iraq debacle was, in any case, that Iran became a stronger regional power. If you let them do all the fighting against this lot, they'll be stronger still.
Well, thank you for bringing me into the program. To be honest, I've heard a few points that sound quite contradictory. First, the Americans and the Iranians have cut a deal in Iraq on managing this country since its occupation. So there's nothing new in the cooperation between the Americans and the Iranians. Number two, the current situation, if someone thinks that a few F-16s, one or two, whatever they're going to rush into Iraq at this moment, is going to change anything. To be honest, the only thing that's going to change is the payload per sortie. But that's not going to change anything on the ground. The reason is the F-16s that are being provided to Iraq are absolutely third-generation F-16s. They have absolutely none of the high-tech equipment that the Americans have. So there's absolutely no way to compare this with whatever the Americans have. This F-16 deal was a waste of money, and it's not going to change anything on the ground. It might give Iraq some edge on certain border procurement, but the way the insurgents are fighting the war is they're driving off two vehicles at a time.
But Ahmed, I mean, even a third generation F-16 is probably pretty effective against no F-16 at all.
Well, I'm just talking about the nature of battles being carried out right now in Iraq. This is an insurgent war. They choose when to strike, where to hit, how to move. Actually, helicopters are much more effective with night vision than a few F-16s flying at 16 or 17,000 feet to avoid anti-aircraft fire. Whoever tries to sell this to people as some kind of achievement that's going to change the outcome is actually lying to them and lying to himself. We've heard enough of warmongers. We've heard enough of people who promote war, especially from people like Tony Blair, who got us into this mess in the first place. The way things are going now on the media, everybody is repeating like a parrot, ISIS, ISIS, ISIS. The U.S. ambassador in Baghdad 3 months ago admitted that ISIS number no more than 2,000 people on the ground. I find it very hard to see that 3 divisions completely collapsed in front of only 2,000 fighters. This is a full-scale people's revolution, whether people who want to admit it or not on the Western media, this is up to them. They're going to wake up and smell the coffee, and they're going to have a really difficult time selling the truth later on to their so-called, followers.
Okay, well, let me put some of those points to people in the studio. I mean, Sabah, one of the things that we've seen, and spectacularly in Syria, is that even if we took that view that it's a kind of people's revolution, it's not necessarily the people who start it who end up politically leading it, and so it is quite conceivable in these circumstances that the motor of this might be a Sunni rebellion, but the political gainers of it can be the people in ISIS, can't they?
That's correct. And as far as Syria is concerned, the mistake which was committed in Syria in this instance, all the powers were competing with each other to buy the various revolutionaries. So the Qataris were buying some, the Turks buying another, the French buying a third one, the Americans are... So you end up with making the quote-unquote revolutionaries fighting each other because each one is being backed by somebody else. The situation in Iraq, number one, none of them, neither the ISIS nor the military council, are willing at this stage, at least for the time being, to deal with the neighbors or with the international force, whether it's the Americans or the French. Of course, they need everybody. But at the end of the day, they have decided not to fall into the trap of the Syrian one. As far as the use of military force, the only way that you get rid of ISIS, whether in Iraq or in Syria, it is for the people there, provided that the outside world deal with that country in a fair manner. The West have been dealing with Iraq from 2003 until now, backing the government, whatever the government is. It doesn't matter how sectarian it is. It doesn't matter how much they abuse their rights. It is about time now that at least there is a balanced view between the various Iraqis, and the only solution will not come from the outside, not from Iran, not from the US, but it's the Iraqis who have to bite the bullet. So you get the Ba'athists talking to the Shiites, and the Shiites talking to the Kurds, and all the various groups. It's going to be extremely difficult, but there is no solution other than that. And most important, Maliki is out of the picture as a person.
Paul, what do you make of the talk that if there is a bombing campaign, that it would be a bombing campaign not only in Iraq, but against Syrian targets as well? Is that hot air?
I don't think it would be many Syrian targets. I could imagine they might go after the ISIS rear areas, but there's probably not much there to target. In principle, they might want to do that, but there just might not be very much on the ground to deal with. On the point about the preconditions for getting out of this, I think, I agree with a lot of that Maliki really should go or be pushed aside, but he probably won't. And Baathists and Sunnis and Kurds maybe all do need to talk to each other, but that isn't going to happen while the jihadis think they're on a roll. That momentum has got to be broken because otherwise, why would they give up? If they think they can achieve or re-exert the dominance that the Sunnis previously had before 2003, they'll go on doing that until it's been proven decisively that they're going to be stopped and pushed back.
Do you think the one thing that bombing might do, this was a case certainly made by by Chris and people before the original war, is that what a bombing campaign does is glue the population to their existing leadership. In this case, could the temporary alliance that exists between ISIS and the Sunni rebellion be turned into a permanent one by a bombing campaign?
Well, I don't think anyone's talking about a bombing campaign, like separate airstrikes as a kind of unconnected strategy. There will be aircraft. There are already some aircraft, and they will be used against ISIS where there is fighting on the ground. So it'll be tactical air support. So that's rather different. But just like another kind of artillery there.
Well, yes, but A, there's a political effect which is quite separate from the military effect, and B, even the military effect will be to hit civilians, will be, collateral damage, and therefore won't the political effect be likely to be the same in the sense that it will push ISIS and the Sunni rebels together?
It depends how skillfully it's done, but I don't see any alternative. They're not, especially with the dissolution of so many irregular units. The government forces and the Shia militia are not going to be able to push back ISIS, which they desperately want to do, without additional firepower. Some of it will come from artillery, which isn't pretty either in what it does. Some of it will come from the air because they'll have to.
I mean, Chris, in many ways, the ISIS people must be hoping for an American intervention, mustn't they?
Yeah, I think the crucial thing is that to support the point that you were making is that this has to be the only way there can be some sort of resolution here is if it's an Iraqi-led process, and it's absolutely vital that we get back to the argument about foreign intervention and the terrible effects that foreign intervention has. And we have to take on both the Blairite argument and the other arguments about the history here.
Do you really think it's the most useful thing to do, to discuss Tony Blair when we're talking about a major civil war in the middle of Iraq?
But what we're talking about...
Why is that such a compulsive theme?
Because there is an attempt to argue that the intervention, the war in the first place, the invasion, wasn't the cause of all this. And there's a reason for that. The reason that Blair is arguing that is because they want to clear the way for further intervention.
That's we have British politics.
Well,
I think the average Iraqi.
But we're in Britain, and what the only foreign policy, the only policy we can have any influence on is the British policy, and perhaps.
And Haig says we're not going to deploy British forces.
Well, yeah, but there's but then we can also have a knock-on to the Americans. That's the truth, and that's we can have some impact on the West.
We'd rather you didn't go there.
Don't interrupt me. I mean, the argument being put not just by Blair but by other people, including Boris Johnson, actually, is that we need to get back. We need to break from the idea that all intervention is wrong and all intervention causes problems. So I do think we need to rehearse these arguments. I mean, the idea that not intervening in Syria caused the problems in Iraq is a ludicrous idea. I mean, the history just is completely wrong. The timeline doesn't work. The sectarianism in Iraq exploded onto the scene in 2005, 2006, way before there was a conflict in Syria. But I do think we need to reassert the argument that the trauma that was created by the invasion back in 2003 is the fundamental problem we do disagree, and so it's an important. That proves that it's an important argument.
You don't think there was a trauma before
Paul, surely, I mean, the broad point. This is recent history. I mean, you were citing 19th century history as an explanation. Well, perhaps, but
let's not forget the recent past.
But
surely, if it's fair enough to quote 19th century history, it's fair enough to quote 9 years ago.
I don't think it's irrelevant. My point is, it's a tragic fact about Iraq that they've had a trauma since about 1968 to 9, when the Baathists took over, and certainly when Saddam took over. If you look at what happened in those years, the atomization, the deprivation, the million losses in the war against Iran, and then the sanctions and all of that. It's impossible.
By the West.
It's impossible to disentangle that from what then happened after Blair.
That's why it's important to talk about Blair.
Let me just
saying exactly what he's saying.
Let me just bring Ahmed in a minute. All right. There's a mass of historical experience that we could draw on, and there are a number of points that we could say are relevant. For you, which are the most relevant of those?
Well, what I see now as what Mr. Paul just spoke is a very good example of Western bankruptcy when it comes to Iraq. they want to give the same input and get a different output. If you do not address the grievances that have happened since the Iranian occupation with the American occupation in Iraq has occurred, and the push away of the Sunnis away from politics, you will not solve this. You cannot solve this by bringing the Islamic Party and claim that these people represent the Sunnis and these people represent the Shiites. They're the only country in the world which has a political system based on sects and religions is the one in place by the Americans in Iraq. The only way you can solve this is by first recognizing that there are revolutionaries on the ground, and they are the major part of this event that is unfolding in Iraq. And it is not ISIS, it is not the media garbage that is marketed by the Maliki regime and accepted by Western mass media. There are true revolutionaries on the ground. There are a collection of nationals, there are Shiites, there are Sunnis, even though it is dominated in Sunni areas, which is more freely movable for these people to work their ways out. There's a lot of pressure on the south by Iran and the government to keep them hushed up, especially in Nasiriyah and Basra. This is not recognized by Western analysts. All they repeat is ISIS, 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 as if there's some kind of Godzilla running around in Iraq cities. No, there is a revolution, and all of this is because of the 2003 invasion of Iraq. And Tony Blair is fully responsible, along with George Bush and everyone who markets their argument that this war is still continues. And I have absolutely no idea what Obama is going to tell his people after he's been marketing this war as a success for the last 8 years. He's going back into Iraq thinking that he's going to solve this issue with bombing this country. This country has been bombed tenfolds over, and this war is continuing. You are not going to get a solution if you think inside the box of the political process.
Okay, let me just put some of those points to the people in the studio. Sabah, the one element actually that we haven't talked about is actually that in the recent elections, even though in many ways they were completely flawed, didn't happen in the Anbar province, which should have been a kind of wake-up call at that point at any rate. But one of the outcomes was that there was a very substantial non-sectarian bloc that came out of that, wasn't there?
No, there isn't. This election, I don't think we can draw any lessons from it, because it's a non-starter on anything, on the structure, on the principle, on the way it was done. And I'm not talking about forgeries and what have you.
I'm not sort of claiming that the election was legitimate. What I'm saying is that within it there was a kind of element presence which isn't reported in the West, which isn't the sectarian divisions. There were some people that were represented that kind of what you might like to call the sort of pre-war Iraqi society.
But quite honestly, all those who stood for the election, most of them are people who want to be part of the so-called political process. If you become an MP in the Iraqi parliament, you get a salary which is higher than the salary of the Speaker of the Congress and the Speaker of the Parliament. You get 60 cars and 60... it's a money-making exercise. If you stand today for the election in Iraq, on any level, and it doesn't matter whether you come as a woman who doesn't want to show her face, puts the picture of her husband, or whether you are not talking sectarian, or indeed, even if you are talking about your own sect or your own tribe. This doesn't really reflect anything. So that's why nobody has taken it seriously. Nobody is drawing any conclusions from that, not even within Iraq itself. Within Iraq, Maliki hasn't been able, forget about all the opposition. Maliki, until now, he cannot even get his own partners in the process to talk about anything. He couldn't get the parliament happening. He can't form the government. When Ja'fari called for a meeting where everybody attended there, they came out with nothing, because they don't know whether this is a losing horse. If you back Maliki and he succeeds, then you will benefit. If you back him and you lose, you've lost totally. So this is the kind of politics which is not really politics in Iraq.
Paul, do you think we're ultimately looking to partition here?
I don't think so. I hope not. But I think we might be in agreement on some points. The Iraqi political system is severely dysfunctional. The Sunnis have been very badly treated. It will be necessary to change the way they're treated to draw them back in again. But to describe this as a national revolution, what's followed from Mosul, with Shiite participation seems to me at the moment quite bizarre. Now, maybe your speaker's got evidence that isn't available to the rest of us. Maybe new facts will appear. But when you have ISIS coming up with an almost exterminatory approach to the Shia as polytheists and filth, I find it hard to believe that any significant number of Shia are going to do anything except want to fight them and push them back.
Yeah, because you're making an assumption that this thing is an ISIS thing. Well, ISIS, who have gone into Mosul, some of them have called for the destruction of the holy places of the Sunnis in Mosul because they said you shouldn't have shrines. Yeah. So it is these. You know, we can take the speak of one guy, and we say this is what's happening. You can take few still picture of some people carrying the black flag and you say, look, I told you this is ISIS. This is where the mutilation of the issue. And I hope that the media will begin to realize if we continue to do that, we're going to end up by still siding with the wrong side. We must at least either be impartial, at least try and say, look, maybe there is ISIS. Nobody is denying it. ISIS people are criminals who are killing Sunnis and killing Shiites and destroying things. They will do it everywhere. So when you have somebody who comes and say he's going to destroy Karbala and Najaf, of course the people in Karbala and Najaf will feel very bad and they will resist. But the assumption that they are all ISIS is where the mistake is.
Chris, do you think that if the Americans, perhaps Obama reluctantly, takes on a bombing campaign now, do you think that the British government stance will be like it was over Vietnam? We're not committing troops, but we support the initiative. Do you think that can be the thin end of a wedge, though? Do you think that if it took time, if it became bogged down, the government might then kind of revert to its previous stance and want to back the US militarily?
I don't think it can be ruled out because, I mean, even now, you know, you clearly do have voices in the British establishment who are either going along with Blair, although I think Blair's a very marginal figure in terms of his opinion. Nevertheless, there are some people who are going at least some way down that road. And actually, one of the reasons why some people in the Tory party, for instance, are distancing themselves from Blair is they think that he's, you know, a problem for that argument, which wants to get back to the idea that humanitarian intervention is a good thing. So, I mean, there's clearly big pressure in general to overcome the Iraq effect and also to reverse the decision that was taken, or to deal with the decision that was taken over Syria, which I think the whole of the British establishment basically dislikes the fact that Parliament voted against war. And I think they are going to have to try and get back at some stage. And if Obama does lead, I mean, already actually they're talking about British special forces being involved, even at this stage, even before Obama's taken a lead on it. So I think, the establishment as a whole is going to be trying to get back to a place where Britain can intervene once again in the Middle East.
OK, well, I'm going to stop you there because that's all we've got time for. This won't be the end of the story in Iraq. I'm sure we all know that, and analysis will be following events as they unfold. Do rejoin us for future episodes. But for tonight, thanks to my guests, thank you for watching, and good night.